Every day, we can experience a full range of emotions, from joy to grief, peace, frustration, and everything in between.
But we're still expected to be an A player at work, be a good partner, to parent children, take care of our animals, and have food on the table, even in the throes of grief. So how the hell are we supposed to do it all?
On the Human Sessions podcast, we'll guide you through strategies for being your authentic self in every part of your life, no matter which emotions are in the driver's seat that day. We'll talk about how human design, energy, and Reiki can all be useful tools for showing up and showing up well.
And if we lost you at the word energy, I promise you will walk away from every episode with tactical tips to feel more like yourself.
I'm Rachel Hatterberg-Walt, human energetics expert and Reiki master.
And I'm Val Marini, grief and trauma specialist and energy healer. This is a no bullshit zone.
This is an anti-perfectionism haven.
This is the Human Sessions podcast. Hi, I'm Val Marini.
Hey, I'm Rachel Hatterberg-Walt.
Today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about grief and trauma and just how that shows up in the Human Sessions, where we're going to talk a little bit more to not only bring to life some of the positive aspects we gain from going through these different journeys, but also go a little bit deeper into what grief and trauma are, how they show up, and how they embed in our lives.
We can bring a little bit of context to how your human design blueprint can help you get through those times of disruption.
Just share a little bit about my story, and certainly Rachel and I will get deeper as our episodes go on, not only our lived experiences, as well as how we came together, how our work goes together. But truly, I think the first thing that we really like to acknowledge, and even in our conversations with each other on a daily basis, is that grief is not this like acute moment. Grief is one of the most universal experiences we have in life. Any change, any disruption, any moment where we're not fully grounded in security and certainty and knowing exactly what's going on, which for me has been like 95% of life.
Yeah. That's being a human.
Yeah. And I think there were many, many years where I didn't really understand that. And where grief and trauma kind of collide and intersect are those areas where we either develop or perpetuate cycles that could be destructive to ourselves or to our relationships or, the lives that we want to lead. And they're not necessarily like these huge moments. It's just like little subtle things. It's the tiny little choices we make. It's the moments in our car where we feel like we have no one to call, or in the shower where you like meet despair, or even I would say those moments when like the shopping bag gets caught on the doorknob and you lose your ever loving shit because everything else has been piled up and we have been conditioned to kind of handle it, or some of us have been conditioned to handle it. And you marry conditioning, going through life, with just your human design and who you are and what your DNA is like, and then layer on just like accumulated moments of stress without release and stalled energy, blocked energy, just feeling of stuckness.
Well, and lack of awareness of it too is
Totally.
where I have found, looking back throughout my life, this shows up in more of those times where my expectations were different than the outcome, or a loss of something that maybe was even positive in our collective judgment, but there's still a letting go of the old to embrace the new. Like I recently moved, and it's all good things, and it was out of my own, catalyst to make that decision, but there's still grief of leaving a home that I brought my third child home to, and in a neighborhood that I really enjoy and love. And I don't think our society recognizes that absolutely at all.
Yeah.
Like I have met grief initially through the loss of someone close to me. And I think that's where a lot of us meet grief. We don't recognize. It's not that it wasn't there. We don't recognize where it was in all those little times, and then much less have the tools to cope.
Totally. And I think when we meet grief in those moments where it's defined as grief, like it's societally expected to be grief. I mean, we can go deeper into this, but there's also no playbook for that. How long can you grieve? It's like, who's asking for that permission and who's telling you need permission for that? But it's like we learn it in those moments where it's introduced to us as a concept, but don't recognize that like usually those acute moments are actually the trauma. The grief is the experience beyond that. The grief is what happens when the trauma happens and you're like, how do I recalibrate my whole life, my perspective, what I've known?
Right. And do you want to define for everyone listening, if they're not familiar with kind of the technical terms we're talking
Mhm.
about, when you say, grief happens after the big T or little t
Yeah.
trauma, what do you define as trauma?
So, trauma for me, in that scenario, it would be the impact of loss, right? Whether you have lost a human, lost something of value, lost your sense of safety, lost your sense of self. And that can come in a variety of ways. We typically hear about trauma when it relates to like abuse, and that's like such a broad spectrum of things, but it's truly like you're experiencing trauma when you are unable to feel grounded and feel safe. Like you're experiencing a trauma, whatever that may be for you. And capital T trauma, I think, would most often be in like an abusive situation when you can identify that moment of impact, when it is like something happens and your world shatters in that moment for what you think will be forever. You're
Mm.
unable to dissociate from that feeling in that moment, and it feels like nothing matters
Well, and
anymore.
I've also heard it described as like too much, too
Mhm,
fast, to
mhm.
where our coping skills and our neurology totally shuts down and doesn't know how to cope
Yeah,
in that moment. And unless we manage it, deal with it,
yeah,
heal with it, it doesn't always go away, heal with it, it's going to stay in our bodies. It's going to be something that we are hold either consciously in our
yeah,
thoughts that we think about or ruminate about or create more mental health issues, or it could be stuck in our physical body where we're
yeah,
manifesting physical symptoms, or in our emotional body where we're experiencing maybe emotional disturbances of some
yeah.
way.
Well, and it's hard also because when we talk about like fight or flight, that's like trauma on repeat, right?
Mm.
So
Re-traumatizing
triggers,
ourselves.
re-traumatizing. I wouldn't, if it's linked to a capital T trauma where it's like very, very acute, I would say that's just like continuation of the capital T trauma. The like lowercase t trauma is more like it still makes you feel unsafe, but it hasn't completely shattered your nervous system and your ability to regulate yourself.
Okay.
It's an underlying like small traumas or like things that impact you, I believe, because of larger traumas or because of a larger disconnect from who you are or what makes you feel safe. So it's like, I kind of lump them together because I think for two reasons. Number one, I want to normalize using the word without overusing it, which is actually kind of a challenge. I think there's such a stigma against the idea of talking about or having trauma. Like it's such toxic, pervasive shame that comes with the idea of trauma, where it's like, no, this is universal. This is just like breathing. You're born and you're breathing. You are going to experience trauma. You are going to experience grief. And there are some things that happen, and capital T trauma would be like, those experiences that actually change your brain, change how your brain is wired. It's like with
In a kind of a
early
boom way, in an acute way, in some
yeah,
big, shocking type way.
bigger shocking, but I would say like significantly overrides your ability to self-regulate. So like sometimes when we're talking, it's obviously you can experience all throughout life, but if you have experienced early childhood trauma, that is acute during developmental years. So it could be like acute moments of abuse or loss or suffering, or it could be prolonged scarcity, or you're not getting, you talked about the hierarchy of needs, like you're not getting for a prolonged period of time what you need. So maybe you grew up unhoused and with food insecurity and emotional insecurity, a lack of secure attachment to like a caregiver or truly anybody that can make you feel safe. And as a small child, you did not learn how to, you did not receive co-regulation, so you did not also learn how to self-regulate, that is trauma.
What do you mean by self regulate?
So self-regulate is the ability to get yourself out of fight or flight, to lower the cortisol levels in your body by, and this is where it comes into where, like, of course, what child has this blueprint of like breath work, of how do you, I would call it like returning to yourself. And I'll try and explain it in the context of like how I've experienced it, where before I had really gotten through all of my, not that I'm through all of it, but like the bulk of really understanding my trauma work, I lived fully dysregulated. Like I was anxious all the time. I was quick to startle. Everything would give me anxiety. New experiences where I should have had confidence. Anything that was like outside of the realm of, because I started to like tighten my world up little by little until I was like wound so tight that it wasn't about healthy boundaries, it was protective boundaries, because it was like, I feel like I am a ticking time bomb of I'm going to cry, I'm going to just completely melt to the ground, I'm going to shut down. I could not handle anything more. Like the glass was full of water. One more drop would like not just overflow the water, like the glass would explode. And regulation is something that we learn as children. It's a lot of like why we do like skin to skin with kids, is to like regulate them. It's co-regulation when you're growing up, and you're in those early developmental years, and like what good enough parenting is kind of the baseline. But what secure attachment is different, which is, are you, when you see the person that you're supposed to trust, do they make you feel safe? Do they make you feel unsafe? Is their emotional regulation strong enough to help you calm down? It's like when you're in crisis, if there's someone you trust, like a best friend, a partner, and anybody, and you're in crisis or you're super anxious or you're in grief and you're not able to regulate, if they can hold you that secure, it's like the thunder jacket, thunder coat that we use for dogs. It's like it's the human equivalent of that. If they hold you and breathe with you, can you calm it down? I know with like my partner, there's a lot of dysregulation at times. And it's like, I know how now to regulate and to do my breathing and to slow my heart down and to create calm, safe energy. And I can feel with him that same response to my regulation. And what we struggle so much with is learning that, because we're not taught.
Well, no. And I think where, we might enter into this work is having behaviors as an adult and we don't know how to handle it.
Yeah.
Or we've been operating in a certain way like you, where one more thing happens and it's all going to implode. And that's really evidence of things that happened when we were children, when our neurological system was being developed. And
Yeah.
those patterns, run through the gamut of our life experience.
Yeah. And I think we see it a ton also. Like, I love talking about the early childhood and the family part. And I want to call out also, a lot of this is so new. We've learned so much through science. We've learned so much through like different practices. What I want to avoid, especially if there's anyone listening who maybe is a parent of an adult child, like just recognizing, or I'll call it out for myself because I'm super happy to be open with this. Like, I recognized that some of the things that I have struggled with and some of the work that I've done were unintentional repetitions of generational trauma. Like I can trace back through like my mom's lineage and my grandmother, and like there's practical rationale for why they showed up in the way that they showed up and what they were equipped for and what they were not equipped for. And so the hard work is actually like doing this without placing blame on like, well, I am like this because of my mom. Well, yeah, there are aspects of the trauma and my behaviors and the grief and dysregulation that I inherited from my mom. Sure. She only had the tools and resourcing to get her incrementally forward to the place that, yes, she has that responsibility to progress herself. And that's I'm not making an excuse for that, nor would I suggest that for anybody, just like I'm not making that excuse for myself. Like, if I don't like these cycles and if I don't like these patterns that don't serve me and make me feel less than or um, anxious or afraid or like I don't have the right to take up space or whatever it is, um, that is my work.
Mhm. Well, and I think when we're speaking about generational trauma or patterns
Mhm.
through generations, it's like we're in a relay race, and
Yeah.
our ancestors in the world that they were born into could get us so far, and then in
Hmm.
the next generation, that person takes the baton and runs it through that world. Well, our world is a lot different than our
Yep.
parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, in so many ways, in every aspect, honestly. So I think it's our responsibility now that we are more resourced, we're more connected as far as communication goes. We're able to understand some of these topics because science has addressed some of these
Yep.
patterns that our parents and grandparents had no clue was going on, had no awareness. And so holding them responsible for something they had no clue about is hard too. It
Yeah.
doesn't excuse it. They don't get a
No.
pass for that, just like we don't. But for
Yeah.
things that our children and children's children are going to find out of ways that we showed up that maybe aren't as resourceful or helpful as our kids and grandkids
Yeah.
needed or whatever. But it's understanding, it's holding that duality of I understand how this happened and I can also see a way to change it so everyone around me, including me, is impacted for a greater good. And so we can
Yeah.
heal and move it to a more positive resourced place in the future.
I love the analogy of the relay race because that's truly what it feels like. And it doesn't mean making excuses for other people's behavior or how it impacted you. It's just finding those ways, and it takes time and it takes work and it takes resourcing to kind of step away from that. Like, step out of the arena for a second and go, "Oh, okay, I understand like cause and effect. This was the input, this was the output. This is how I received it."
And this
Now,
is the context that that was enabled to happen
exactly, but
too.
also this is my journey. I show up for myself, as myself, responsible for myself every single day. And that is how I show up to change the generational cycles that I do not like, that I don't want to participate in. And it's also how I show up with others and what I'm perpetuating in them. And so it's a very interesting world to be in. When I was going through my healing, I had to really dissociate myself from, in a healthy way, dissociate from the idea of like hierarchy or parenting. And there's this concept that's like super cookie cutter of this is the parent and this is the child and these are your roles and this is how you show up and this is the responsibility. And it's like, yeah, maybe in a perfect world where everyone's resourced, like we could have that level of safety and a recognition that at closer to end of life, there's an exchange of that baton in a very different way, where like the role of the caregiver and the one cared for kind of shifts. Like, those things are generally kind of acknowledged and practiced, but we're not really prepared for it because if we're operating in that context, we spend our whole lives feeling like we should be the ones cared for and like I didn't get X and they didn't do this for me. And, you
Which is
know,
a coping
uh,
unhelpful coping strategy in and of itself
totally.
too, right? Because when we're feeling um victimhood, we
Hmm.
want someone to blame. We want
Totally.
our power back, and that's a way to get our power
We
back,
don't
which
want to
is
do
to
this work.
say,
It's hard and it's
yeah,
shitty.
right. It's really hard to say this happened and also instead of this happened so blah blah blah,
Yeah.
um,
Or like, this happened.
or
What
didn't happen.
invitation have I received for my own work? Like, this happened as an invitation for me to be like, wow, I'm totally ingrained in this cycle. I am completely not driving this car right now. It's like emotion, it's reactivity. And it's just so interesting because going back to the like dissociation part, like, I had to look back at my parents and be like, what if I looked at their journeys in parallel to mine the way that I do as my friends or the way that I do for my friends, where I can practically be like, this was their trauma input. This was the resourcing available to them. This is how they showed up. Could it be possible that they are suffering more than me?
Right. It really breeds a lot of compassion and
Mhm.
grace for other people and for ourselves too, and meeting them where they were and meeting us where we are. And that's a really nice place to be able to feel curious enough to do this work. I guess the first step to most anything would be the awareness of it.
Mhm.
So, using tools to enable awareness of our generational patterns that have contributed to this situation, the collective messaging and patterns that we see from our world, and then the patterns we experience in our own life because of our own lived
Mhm.
experience. To have awareness of those patterns, I think, is step one to be able to be on a healing journey to enable us to show up as our authentic self and really embody that authentic self.
No, totally. It's like, to your point, it's like recognizing it. And then it's easy to be like, oh, this is my pattern as an excuse. It's
Right.
like, no, that's like
I
an
think that's probably a phase, like a mini
totally.
phase in the healing journey. It's like, oh, well, this happened to me. So, of course, I'm going to be reactive. Sorry. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, yes, and you still have responsibility for your behavior and hold that tendency
Mhm.
without using it to harm yourself or others.
No, yeah, I differentiate it as like that's the explanation. It is not the excuse. Like
Mm,
once we know we have a bad pattern and like that's been recognized, like the responsibility part kicks in
hmm
and it no longer is an excuse for behavior. With children, it's one thing.
Well, they're not
As
even fully developed yet, right?
totally. They have so much more trauma and grief they need to get through before they start this work.
Yeah.
But it's just it was an interesting place of once we recognize it, we start that work and then it becomes this like routine of recognizing and starting to have the awareness in the body, not of the behavior, not of the external factors. Like those are really important. Those are the first kind of like indicators and informers. But probably once you get into the work, or at least for me, it was like, oh, wow, no, this is how this showed up in my body. I would feel this thing, whether it was anxiety or fear, which is essentially the same thing, or like
And
my
where it
stomach
is and the
hurt.
quality of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Migraines, stress response. Like anytime you feel, we all know the difference, but we can often condition ourselves out of remembering what it feels like to feel good, like to feel good and feel energized and feel powerful. And um, it's both not as simple and not as hard as we think. It's truly about like getting back in touch with like, oh, wow, this thing constantly puts me in this physical space or this emotional space or this mental space and recognizing how little things show up, what arises, feeling that response in the body. And then the magical part, which is also the like shittiest, most avoidable, most like just uncomfortable part of all of it is sitting in the discomfort of whatever's like arising in your body and learning what tools work for you, what grounding works for you. For me, it's like I unintentionally started doing self Reiki,
Mhm.
which was like I would to calm myself down. I'm like, okay, I just like need to lay down and I need to shut my eyes. And I would go into my like little healing posture with like my one hand over my heart, my other over my stomach, and would sit there and breathe and would be like, okay, I now need to like mentally reconnect myself with the reality of the situation. I am
Mm.
safe. I am fine. What just happened that brought up this emotion? Why is this emotion rising up? And, we can obviously go down the like meditation path and like
Mhm.
doing the like inner child work and all of those things that are super, super helpful. But at like baseline one, step one out of the trauma response was like regrounding and being like, no, I need to remind myself I am safe. I am fine. This is just a moment. I can actually work through this on my own in the next 5 minutes and re-baseline myself to like a general framework that like how I simplified it for myself was like once I got into that position and was like, okay, what is true? What do I have enough information to be certain about? Is this truly life threatening? Sometimes it may be, and that's a completely different consideration and it's a valid response. Day to day for me, I was usually safe. It was not it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with someone else's response or someone else's action based off of where they were in their moment. It's like, okay, this is not my shit.
That discernment's so hard when you're used to that
Yeah.
until you have the awareness of it. Would you say that embodiment then is the reconnection of the mind to the body, to the energy, and then creating a balanced situation so your reasoning can come back
Yeah.
online and then you can make a more informed choice?
Yeah. I mean, I would say like more bluntly, it's like learning how to feel safe in yourself for yourself, where no one and nothing around you is the thing that's going to make you feel safe. Embodiment is like all of our energies returning to our center. It's realigning so that like we can breathe again. Our nervous system can regulate again. Embodiment is then, it's like, I'm not doing this thing because I'm supposed to be doing it. I'm doing this thing because this is what I need in this moment. It's like so many different ways to explain it, but it's also like sitting in the moment and be like, what does this is like such a Ted Lasso thing. And I'm hating
Mhm.
myself and loving myself for it at the same time. But it's like knowing what your body needs. When you're embodied, you're like, I'm going to go take a walk because that's what I need. Or I feel like I need like a little protein because I'm deficient. You're so in tune with your hierarchy of needs and your emotions. And you are just, it's like embodiment is also confidence,
Mm.
embodiment is certainty. It's those moments. And I remember going in and out of it, which like I'd have moments where I'm like, so in myself. You show up anywhere, you're just doing your thing. You're confidently walking through the world, confidently walking through life. And then, like, the smallest interaction with somebody, their tone, a word they say to you, a thing you see, it could even, like, I would disembody myself from social media, where it's like something that someone else was doing was able to take me out of my
Mhm.
alignment and myself. Like, that's so wild to think about.
Well, and that's been a lot of my own healing journey that I got a lot more clarity around knowing my human design. One of
Mhm.
my big energies that I hold, according to my human design and in my own lived experience, is this reactionary patterning,
You're
which
fiery,
is, yeah,
fiery Aries.
fiery and just like popping off or reacting in some unconscious way. And that's how I, came into the work was my reactivity in the context of parenting and
Mhm.
seeing, okay, I want to show up this way with kindness, with compassion, with consciousness, with intention. But when this happens, my body gets so hot and fiery, I
Mhm.
disembody, and then I scream, I yell, I slam a door or do something that is not teaching my kids kindness and compassion, which are really grounded feelings and emotions. And so that has been the work of my life. And the human design has helped pinpoint and give context to the
Yeah.
reactionary, but then the lived experience of childhood trauma and
Mhm.
adulthood trauma and this rapid world that we live in really kind of puts the cherry on top as far
Yeah.
as the reactivity goes. But thank God we do have embodiment tools like mindfulness, like, psychological work and mental health work, like physical education and fitness, like mind, body, spirit integration tools that get us paying attention to our bodies. Where are our
Yeah.
emotions? What does regulation feel like? There for a while, that was step one was, okay, I have the awareness, but now what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, okay, I know I want to show up this way, but how do I do it? And breath work and talk therapy and meditation and mindfulness and treating my body as the vessel that it
Yeah.
is kind of all work at these dimensions together to where now certain behaviors can happen with my kids and I can remain calm in my body and I do feel regulated. Now if that happens over and over and over,
Yeah.
I'm gonna be dysregulated again and then I got to go back to square one where I'm like I have to remove myself and kind of go back to that first healing phase. So,
Yeah.
would you say that embodiment isn't necessarily like the peak of a mountain or
Oh
the summit
god,
of a mountain
no.
where we're finally reached and then we can just like cruise through the rest of our life?
No. I mean,
Okay.
I we were talking about this
So,
earlier,
I'm
like,
not doing this wrong, is what you're saying.
no, embodiment is like it's the perpetual goal. It's like where we want to be, and we're gonna go in and out of that over time
It's like
because
driving then. So, like, there's a lane. We want to stay in the lane. We're constantly adjusting
Yeah.
that steering wheel, and it doesn't mean we're bad if we go to the right, and
No.
we're not bad if we go to the left. We're just constantly adjusting so we can stay on the road and not
Yeah.
drive off
But
the
I think
cliff.
it's also, and I love that you brought this up because this has come up with clients and friends and everyone who's either like watched me on this journey or started their own, where typically the starting point comes from a bad place. Like we're not naturally like, I feel amazing. I'm gonna start doing some deep healing work.
Right.
It's like that like moment where you're like, I thought I hit rock bottom, but there was rock bottom, 50 feet of crap, and then me. And you are just so in it that you're like, I have no other choice but to start this.
Mhm.
Or at least that's how I entered it, where I was like, I cannot sustain this. Like, I will not survive this. It was messy and it wasn't streamlined. And it like took me many, many years to like piece together parts before I like landed in the deep work. But when you're going through it, and for me, I went like all in at one time. And like, turns out I'm amazing at boundaries if I'm like basically just holding up in my house. I'm a super good homebody. But you go through this work and like when you first start it, you have to truly cut off everything that was unhealthy, that's known unhealthy to you, that you know is a trigger to you. It's like any addiction, because it's like the root of addiction is disembodiment as well. Or sorry, unembodiment, whatever we're going to say. But addiction, whatever we're reaching towards, like we talk about it mostly in the context of drugs and alcohol, but it's anything that we can't let go of, but is not making our lives better and happier and healthier and more balanced and stable. And so I went super deep into it. And 6 months on the other side, I was like, I have never felt better. This is amazing. I have so much clarity. I'm so aligned. I know where I'm going. This is what I want to do. But you have to then go back out into the normal world. And sometimes, like throughout the process, you're going back into the normal world, but your world is changing.
Mhm.
And when we're in the serious intention of the work, it's easy to like create a bubble. It's easy. I don't want to say easy, but it's necessary and is a part of it to create a bubble. When we then have to emerge from that bubble, there's often a misconception, and it makes absolute practical sense that we're like, I'm never going to let this go. I'm going to feel like this forever. This is the new me. This is how I'm going to be. Well, guess what? Like, life's going to bring you a new trauma, and
Well,
it's
that's
going
what's
to,
being a human, right? We
exactly.
don't get out of here scot-free. And just because, we've reached a point where we've done some healing work, and in these certain circumstances, we don't feel that kind of
Yep.
overwhelmingly triggered, dysregulated response. We've maybe moved past that level, but I've heard people say healing is like kind of a spiral up, like a
Yep.
vortex up. So it's not that you're going to get rid of these patterns to where you don't have to think about them anymore. You just might be feeling more resilient in certain situations. So then when you see it again in another
Hmm.
situation, it might not trigger you as much, but it's still going to be these ever present themes. And
Or
that's
it
what the human
will.
design chart will show you too.
Yeah.
Like what's your flavor of theme that you're going to have to work on all the time? Mine is reactivity, and abandonment is another one. Fear of like not making an impact is another
Yeah.
one. And so I think when you can identify them, it's helpful so you feel resourced and you feel resilient, but it's not going to get rid of it.
No,
Yeah.
you're learning over time how to handle the trigger,
Yeah.
what you need to do. It's like, when do you need to remove yourself from the situation versus like, for me, it'd be like, I'm going to push forward. Like, resilience to me was pushing forward deeper into trauma. It wasn't backing away from it, resourcing and going in a different direction, but it is today.
Well, and we are so plastic. I'm also a speech pathologist, and I learned about neuroplasticity and how, as children, we grow and we change and we build new neural connections, but that never stops. We are
Yeah.
growing adults even later in adulthood that can learn and grow and create these new neural pathways, and these trauma response or just triggered response, these dysregulated response are really just pathways that have been embedded more. So, to
Yeah.
create a new neurological pathway to enable you to have a response instead of a reaction, it takes repetition, it takes time, it takes awareness, it takes tools. It's like learning a new skill.
Yeah.
And at first, you're going to be so overwhelmed and mentally it's not going to feel clear and you're trying to put all these pieces together, but then doing it over and
Yeah.
over and finding resources and finding self-worth enough to reach out and get support for this work
Well,
is
and there's
half the
also like a
battle.
fear, or at least I experienced, I don't know how you experienced it. I experienced on the other side of it a fear of like, in this moment, I know all of my tools. I'm connected to my resourcing. I feel good. I know what to do. I've changed patterns. I've changed behaviors. Oh my God, I don't want to lose this. Like a fear
Mm.
of losing it, which is, I think, super, very, very natural. I'll piggyback on your comment about just like the neural pathways and like, oh, we get to the other side of it. And like, I was afraid of losing that resourcing or like not knowing how to get back to it. And it took me a little while to realize like it was like the environments and the people and like what you're taking in. And normally we talk about that in terms of like ingesting like food and it's like whole foods and paleo and all that stuff. And that's great. And I super believe in feeding yourself and fueling yourself with like what you know makes you kind of operate the best. But it's also like who you allow in and the environments that you stay in and the information that you consume. And I found that like once I got to the end of that healing work, some of the environments that I hadn't left yet that were super toxic for me, that either were like just like the patterns and the systems that I was participating in made it impossible for me to stay embodied. I had to leave those environments. And more recently, I'm in much better environments and I have resourced myself in totally different ways, but I'm still a member of like this collective global society. And for me, social media and just like I would say political media at the moment, my own personal climate anxiety, this like existential dread that kind of intersects through it all has been like absolutely at its peak. And so I've had to go back to kind of the baseline so many times recently where it's like I'm so grateful that I've done the work because I can recognize in the moment like, hey, this is coming up for me. What was that last thing I did? Oh, I opened up Instagram and I read somebody's hateful comment. Like, I don't want to participate on either side of hate. I don't care if somebody is super aligned with what I believe in or not. How you show up, the care in the words, the actions that you take. And that for us here in North Carolina has been a very, very acute experience over the last couple of weeks with Hurricane Helene and the devastation that we've seen and have experienced and the impact and the ripples that are, throughout our state and beyond for anybody who's ever been here or loved these communities. But where I really had to, in the most recent past, resource and calm myself, and this is something you and I talk a ton about, is just that is a collective moment of grief. It's an individual moment of grief. There's trauma associated with it. It's going to trigger all sorts of scarcity traumas and scarcity fears that we all have. And what cut through that for me was the community response and how the people who are impacted and who the people who are immediately trying to help, how that showed up in community as pure human connection and community and healing.
Mhm.
It has been super, super beautiful. And where I got dysregulated from that and where I started to like, I would say like ping pong was feeling protective of that healing experience for myself and for these communities and for anyone who's listening. I have a home there and I'm a part of a community just outside of Asheville that like I love. We have wildly different political beliefs and I have experienced only community and love and acceptance. And it's just been so beautiful. And I then took this protector role that I can't take, a protector role for them that was like not protecting me.
Well, and I think you're speaking to the balance of individual care and
Yeah.
collective care. And how can we maintain a sense of individual balance and regulation to be able to show up for people that are
Hmm.
unable to do that because their basic needs were taken away and
Yep.
they're experiencing extreme loss of loved ones, of home, of safety, of financial
Yep.
resourcing, of basically everything that we cling to as humans, and to reach out in humanity for ourselves to take care of ourselves and able to enable us to show up for those people where
Yeah.
they can't show up for themselves right now because
It's
houses
impossible.
are gone, people are gone, finances are gone,
Water is
businesses are
gone.
gone, water is gone, power is gone. And when you are taken down to such an extreme level of loss, we as people a little removed from that, a little stepped back from that,
Yeah.
although we are also experiencing our own level of trauma and loss and grief, how can we maintain that individual self-care and also wrap our
Well,
hands and arms around these people in their, extreme
time of need.
loss and time
Well,
of
it's also
need?
like it's interesting because my initial response to it was I think like my grief and trauma resourcing, my grief and trauma response. But I did go back and I would actually like love your input on this because I was like, okay, I'm feeling super in my ADHD right now, which to me translates to I'm a manifestor generator. That's my human design.
They mimic each
And I
other.
am like wanting so badly to solve for the collective whole. And then I get like super, super micro on like individuals that I need to help.
Mhm.
And I became fatigued immediately and was like, I don't have energy for either of these things.
Mhm. Well, I think
Um,
that makes sense for your energy profile, but I
yeah.
think even more than just ADHD and manifesting generators are experiencing that exact thing. I don't have a
Yeah.
diagnosis of ADHD or I'm not a manifesting generator. And I was also experiencing that. Well,
Yeah.
one of my friends lost her home here in Charlotte because of flooding. So I want to help her. But then I'm also seeing all of these images on social media and the news and through my own networks of friends and people of like people that I need to help over here. And really, I think that's
Yeah.
probably a natural response to a natural disaster, a collective
Also hyper
experience.
empathy.
Yes, yes.
We're
And
both
feeling
very
collective
ill
energy
in that
and
way.
individual energy.
Yeah.
Exactly. That would be a triggered response as well of like
Mhm.
sending money here, throwing money there, blah, blah, blah. And then there's so many organizations and people that need so much. And I think it's probably also very common to totally disengage and totally be like, well, I can't do anything right now.
Oh,
And there's
absolutely.
place, honestly, for both because disruptions like this that are on such a wide scale and such a big scale and so widespread are going to take time to rebuild and time
Yeah.
to help that maybe people can show up initially with the resources they've got and the energy they've got and then other people that totally shut down initially can regulate
Yeah.
themselves and start showing up later
No,
as
I
well.
love
So
that. Like, because that goes right into like the purpose of human design and how, and what I find to be the most valuable tool is to understand other people's energy sources, what mine is. That once again, that like relay baton concept of like, hey, like someone needs to tap in and someone needs to
yeah.
tap out. We cannot all sustain this for the full duration.
Well, and we can't expect all of us to show up regulated when something so disruptive happens
Oh
too.
God, no.
And to find the grace and the understanding around the human experience
Yeah.
around that, I think is really
Well, and to make sure
healing
that we're
too.
putting our energy into the thing that we feel like matters in that moment. And maybe it does. And there's a ton of amazing first responders and people who are on the ground. And like the fact that they immediately activated and had that energy is a gift to all of us.
Mhm.
It is like a gift to humanity. But I think I'm starting to learn better, or I've been learning better what my limit is, where I'm like, I have this much energy for this before I start reacting to other things in my life.
That are
And
not
like
as helpful.
that are
And
not
yeah.
helpful. Like if I'm showing up, I'm like, I'm going to save all of Western North Carolina. But then in like my personal life, I'm like snapping at people and I'm super short and I'm like stressed out, like also not productive. Those ripples are a little bit harder to navigate. Probably a good time to wrap this one up, but we'll get a little bit deeper into grief, trauma, embodiment, how it connects with human design and some of the tools and resourcing, as well as just more dialogue and conversations in next episode. So thank you for joining. Please don't forget to follow us wherever you follow podcasts and on YouTube.
Thank you so much for listening to Human Sessions. If you loved this episode, please make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can join our Human Sessions. We'll see you in the next episode.